everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm bringing you my very first wrap-up of the year where I'm going to be telling you about all of the books that I read in January 2018. I managed to read a whopping 12 books in January. Admittedly, quite a few of them were rather short, but that's okay. I'm going to kick things off by telling you about the books that I read as part of my What the Hell Happened to My Hauled series, and I will leave that linked down below if you're interested in finding out more about it. But essentially, this is just a little motivational tool that I'm using to help me read loads of backlisted books, some books that I hauled a really long time ago that I've just kind of forgotten to get to. The first of those books is a short story collection and is Bream Gives Me Hiccups by Jesse Eisenberg. So a lot of these are short stories, but a lot of them are more like scenes. They're like small scenes rather than fully fleshed out stories. I didn't find this collection particularly memorable, but I found it a really entertaining read. I thought it was really fun. If you like Jesse Eisenberg's kind of sense of humour, if you've seen any of his movies before, then I think you would really enjoy this collection. It has a lot to do with the little weird things that humans do, and a lot of the scenes are kind of like parodies of human nature. I actually read this book in one sitting. I really enjoyed it. It wasn't particularly memorable, but I would definitely recommend it if you are looking for a quick and fun read. I also read 2 non-fiction books as part of this challenge, the first of which was Beyond the Pale by Emily Urquhart. This is a non-fiction book that is all about albinism. Emily's daughter was born with white hair, very pale skin, white eyelashes, and it follows the family's journey as they explore their daughter's condition, learn more about it, and learn more about how people react and treat people with albinism, not only in the Western world, but throughout history and in other cultures. Certain cultures and throughout history, people with albinism have been very much mistreated. A lot of people believed that individuals that had albinism would possess special powers, that their body parts could be used in medicine. I thought this was a really fantastic account of something that I didn't know very much about going into this book. I think it raised a lot of interesting points and questions about how we think of people with bodily difference. I also thought this was superbly written. Emily did a fantastic job. I'm really glad that I got around to reading this one. The second non-fiction book I read as part of What the Hell Happened to My Hauls was Living a Feminist Life by Sara Ahmed, and oh boy was this book quite heavy. I really struggled to get through this book, and that's in no way a bad thing. It's in no way a negative. It's just this wasn't the book that I was expecting to read. This is of course a book that is all about feminism. It's an incredibly intersectional book. It's not just a book about what it's like to be a woman and to experience patriarchal oppression. It's also a book about what it's like to be a queer woman or a woman of colour, which is utterly fantastic. What I didn't expect from this book was how academic it was. And at the start of this book, Sara Ahmed does make sure that the reader is aware that this is quite an academic book. It's exploring concepts like gender really in depth. If you are someone that writes about gender academically, if you're writing an essay, for instance, then I would highly recommend this book. I think there is so much value in there. It really made me think, but it took me like the whole month to read it because it was really, really heavy and in depth. It's not the kind of book where you can sit down for a few hours and read it. Like, I would read one section and I'd be like, okay, my brain needs a break now. It's still a really, really fantastic book. It just wasn't the type of book that I anticipated it to be. The only novel that I read as part of this challenge in January was The Fractured Life of Jimmy Dice by Ronan Ryan. If you are interested in participating in the Irish Readathon, info coming in like literally the next couple days, then I would highly recommend this book. I wasn't sure what I thought about it for a lot of the book, but now that I've had a little bit of a break from it, I've been able to process what I really thought of it. This book has such an interesting narration style. It begins with the birth of a set of twins, although only one of these twins survives, and that is our protagonist, Jimmy Dice. Jimmy's twin sister, who unfortunately died, plays a really interesting narrative role in this book. If you liked the kind of narrative style of The Book Thief, then I think this is something that you would really enjoy. They are this kind of spirit that can move between characters' minds within a certain extent and observes the story from this kind of above position. And we also have diary entries from Jimmy himself, and this book is essentially what it says on the tin. It is just a book about his life and all the different experiences that he goes through. So he goes through a gambling problem, he deals with his mother's mental health issues. When he is a child, he has to have one of his legs amputated because of a very violent dog that attacked him. We see him dealing with his friendships and his romantic relationships, and one romantic relationship in particular plays a really central role in the plot of this book. All of the characters in this book are really complex and they're really flawed, which is something that I really value in strong character craftsmanship. And there are definitely characters in this who are much more flawed and horrible than other characters. This book also delves into the backstory of the parents and grandparents of Jimmy, and I am literally all about that. I love learning about like family histories in books. There were a couple of moments in this book where I wasn't sure what the author was trying to say. There were a few moments in this book where I thought, is the misfortune of women or violence against women being used just to further the plot of a male protagonist? And there were a couple of moments where I thought it may have strayed into that area, but I don't think the author was trying to push any opinion onto the reader. I don't think at any point they were saying, this is what I think about this situation. I think it is just presenting you with the life of this man and being like, think what you will of it. I think this book was really, really well written. I don't think it was perfect, but I think it was a really great depiction of contemporary Ireland, and I would definitely recommend it. Next, I really quickly want to talk about 3 children's picture books that I read in January, the first of which was the Mood Hoover by Paul Brown. This was probably my least favourite of the 3 picture books that I'm going to talk about, but essentially it is about a little boy that thinks of himself as a bit of a supervillain. He has this machine, the Mood Hoover, which can suck all the happiness out of things, so he goes around his town sucking all the colour out of bright and beautiful things. He takes the stripes away from zebras in his local zoo, but one day his Mood Hoover breaks, and this makes the little boy very sad. I won't tell you what happens next because, you know, I don't want to spoil the ending, but I thought it was a really fun little story. There was nothing about it that made me go, wow. If you have a child in your life who you think might enjoy this one, it is a very colourful one, and then I would still highly recommend it. And I think it would be a really great tool to use to prompt conversations with the child about dealing with their emotions. I have another children's book by Paul Brown, and that is The Hackneyed Martian. I enjoyed this one a lot more. This is about a little boy named Sam who comes across a Martian spaceship, and this Martian tells him that he needs diamonds to fuel his spaceship. And according to his diamond detector, there are some very large diamonds nearby. The only problem is, they belong to the Queen of England. So Sam and his new Martian friend have to sneak past the ravens, sneak past the beef eaters and all of the security in order to steal the diamonds, but all doesn't go to plan. Eventually, Sam does find an accidental way to save the day, and this is just a really fun story. I would highly recommend it. My favourite children's picture book that I read this month, however, was Claude the Magnificent by Chris Capstick. This book was so much fun and it was so beautiful. This is about an artist who is a cat named Claude, who decides to move from the French countryside to Paris in order to pursue his ambition of becoming a world-famous artist. But Claude soon discovers that it is difficult to make any money from your art. Relatable. He works out that his niche little area is going to be making magnificent hats. That's right, hats for cats. He crafts the most beautiful, stunning hats, and word soon spreads throughout the French nobility and aristocracy, and Claude becomes famous for his beautiful hats. Soon he is commissioned by the King of France to make the most flamboyant, largest, most magnificent hat of all, but something doesn't go to plan. This book is so charming and so lovely, and it has a really brilliant surprise ending. It was such a lovely, charming ending. All of these children's picture books were published by Fourth Wall Publishing, and I would highly recommend those books for either yourself or any child you have in your life. The poetry collection that I read this month was City Psalms by Benjamin Zephaniah. I have always loved everything that I've read from this poet before. He is a Jamaican-born poet that lives in the UK, and that is something that plays a large role in his work, what it is like to be not only to be black in the UK but specifically Jamaican. This book is a response to the British politics and media of the time, and while this was written in, I believe, 1992, it's still so relevant today. His poetry is phenomenal, and it's also written in vernacular, so it's very much written in Benjamin's voice. I love anything that is written in vernacular or dialect. I think it's always really impressive and a really appealing quality in poetry. You should definitely look up Benjamin Zephaniah on YouTube and see if you can find any clips of him reading his poetry, because it's really great to read it on the page, but he reads phenomenally, and he is just so smart. This collection is really intelligent. As I said, I've read some of his poetry before in the past, and I'm really looking forward to reading even more of his work in the future. The next book that I read in January was The Story of Antigone by Ali Smith. I still get incredibly embarrassed when I think about the time when I hauled this book and I pronounced her name Antigone. This book is part of the Save the Story library from Pushkin Children's. The reason that I thought Antigone was pronounced Antigone is because I know nothing about Greek mythology, but I am so glad I read this, and I think in a series of books which are aimed at introducing children to everything from ancient Greece to 19th century Russian literature, I think this was perfect for me to dip my toes in and have the story really broken down for me, nice and simply. Essentially, this is about what a sister does when her brother dies and he is refused the right to a proper burial. He is adamant that he deserves a proper burial. She really fights against the system in order to make this happen, and the bravery that she has in this situation is something that reverberates throughout the entire kingdom. I thought this was a really enjoyable read. Something that I really liked about it is that it is told from the perspective of a crow, so if that's something that you've enjoyed in other works like Max Porter's Grief is a Thing with Feathers, I think you would really enjoy it in this myth as well. Another thing that I really loved about it is not only is it breaking down this story, but not in any way dumbing it down for children. There are also a lot of asides that I think a more grown-up reader would understand. If you have read any of Ali Smith's work in the past, you know that she often talks a lot about politics in her work, and there are a lot of little sarcastic lines that come from the crow that I think you would really appreciate if you have enjoyed Ali Smith's work. One line in particular that stood out to me, this was news. The crow liked a royal wedding. There was always lots of good garbage after a royal wedding. I like this one a lot. Another book that I read in January was Sister Noon by Karen Joy Fowler, and I had a lot of mixed feelings about this book. So this book is set in San Francisco in the mid-1800s. It's primarily centered around an orphanage. We're primarily focusing on two women, one of which is an unmarried white woman who works as the treasurer for a white orphanage. Her name is Lizzie Hayes, and we also have a black woman named Mary Ellen Pleasant who is incredibly wealthy and seems to have the entire area wrapped around her little finger. And I found the dynamic between these characters really interesting. One day Mary Ellen brings a child named Jenny Egypt to the orphanage and claims she is from a well-off, wealthy family who were lost at sea. Lizzie Hayes begins to dig into the past of this child to find out more about where she came from, and also begins to look into the rumours surrounding Mary Ellen's lifestyle and power. At times I was worried that this book would stray into casting a female black character with associations with magic and voodoo, but I think Fowler did a good job of asserting that all of these depictions of Mary Ellen were from rumours in the area and were not grounded in anything factual. However, I didn't really enjoy this book. It's got a very lyrical, kind of whimsical writing style. It's not particularly plot driven, and I don't feel like, even though this book is about exploring the pasts and the roots of characters, I don't feel like it was particularly character driven either. This is definitely a book that has a lot of emphasis on the writing style, and I didn't really think that style was for me. I also went into this book with really high expectations because I absolutely loved Karen Joy Fowler's novel, We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves. I adored that book. I went into Sister Noon kind of anticipating to love it just as much, which was just a bad idea. They're really different books, which I guess just speaks to Karen Joy Fowler's talent as an author, that she can write such different kinds of novels, and I just don't really think Sister Noon was the one for me. The next book that I read in January was The Music Shop by Rachel Joyce, and this is Rachel Joyce's latest novel. I really enjoyed reading her older novel, The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, back in December, and I really enjoyed this one as well. This was a really charming story which is predominantly focused on a character named Frank. I think he's sort of like middle-aged. He runs a music shop in a sort of side street of his town. It's set in 1988 and all of the shops on this street are really struggling. Personally, for Frank, he is refusing to stop selling vinyl in favour of stocking CDs. Like, he is completely refusing to stock any CDs whatsoever. And one day a mysterious, I think it's German woman, arrives in his shop, and gradually the pair dance around forming a friendship, and the story goes on from there. I think Rachel Joyce is able to craft really fantastic characters, and in this book it was no different. All of the characters in this book, no matter how major or minor, see what I did there? It's a book about music. I didn't even mean to do that, it just happened. All of the characters are crafted really, really well, and they're really complex. And not only is this book just a really charming, character-driven story, but this book also has a lot to do with the politics of the time. Like, it's very much going on in the background. So we have things like the independent stores closing down, and we also have the rise of the incredibly racist British political party, the National Front. All of these things are just very quietly in the background, and I think what is really staggering about this book is that in many ways it could very easily be set in the present day. Like, so much of the political undertones of this book are still very much relevant today. Really enjoyed this one. And the final book that I'm going to tell you about today is Emma by Jane Austen, and this is by far my favourite Austen novel that I've read thus far. Side note, I've got this beautiful vintage classics edition of this book, but I think I'm going to unhaul it. I know, shocking. But essentially, I found this book secondhand a while ago, and I just pounced on it because when do you see these editions secondhand? And it is in like completely perfect condition, but I don't actually have that much interest in collecting these editions of Jane Austen's books. I'm much more interested in getting them in the Penguin English Library editions. I may unhaul this one and replace it. Anyway, that's a tangent. I really enjoyed Emma. So, our eponymous protagonist is a young woman who lives in the town of Highbury, and unlike a lot of Jane Austen's heroines, Emma has a substantial fortune of her own, so the idea of getting married isn't something that's massively on her radar. She's not relying on getting married to secure any financial stability, which I thought was a really interesting contrast to what I've read from Jane Austen before. But let me tell you what I bloody well loved about this book. This novel is set in England, but there is a lot of references to Ireland in this book, which is part of this novel's depiction of the Irish question. Quick history lesson: in 1801 the Act of Union was brought in, which kind of made Ireland part of Britain, but there was a mass amount of confusion about what exactly Ireland was in relation to the UK. Was it a province? Was it another kingdom? But in fact, it was its own fucking country that the British just stole. Need to collect my thoughts on this because I love what Jane Austen does in this book in relation to Ireland so much. Essentially, what she does is she satirizes all the romantic notions that English people, and particularly well-off English people, have of Ireland. Satirizes all those notions that come from people that know like jack shit about Ireland. Those people become the butt of the joke. So often in like classic English literature, the Irish person is the butt of the joke, and in this book we're not, and I love it. I fucking love it. So that's it. They are all the books that I read in the month of January. Do let me know down below if you have any thoughts on anything that I've read, and let me know what your favourite book that you read in January was. That's all I'm going to talk about for now, but I will talk to you guys in my next video.